The morning sun cast long shadows across the military cemetery as dozens of uniformed officers gathered for another routine funeral service. Among them stood General Patricia Morrison, her silver stars gleaming against her dark blue uniform, and General Robert Chen, whose chest displayed ribbons from 3 different wars. They had attended hundreds of these ceremonies over the years, each one honoring a fallen soldier with the dignity and respect they deserved. As the crowd began to form near the freshly dug grave, a strange figure appeared at the edge of the gathering. She moved slowly, almost hesitantly, wearing layers of torn clothing that had seen better days. Her gray hair hung in tangled strands around a weathered face marked by years of hardship. Her shoes were held together with duct tape, and she carried everything she owned in a battered shopping cart that squeaked with each step. The security guards noticed her immediately. This was a military funeral, not a public event, and homeless people often wandered into the cemetery looking for shelter or handouts. One guard started walking toward her, his hand already moving to escort her away from the solemn gathering. But something made him pause. The woman wasn't looking around nervously like most trespassers did. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the flag-draped coffin in the distance. Her posture, despite the raggedness of her appearance, held something that seemed almost familiar to the trained military eye. General Morrison glanced over at the disturbance and felt her breath catch. There was something about the way the homeless woman held herself, even in her obvious poverty and desperation. The way her shoulders squared despite being hunched with exhaustion. The way her chin lifted slightly as she gazed at the ceremony unfolding before her. The funeral director, dressed in his formal black suit, approached the generals with obvious concern. "Sirs, ma'am, we have a situation. There appears to be a vagrant who has wandered onto the grounds. Should I have security remove her before the service begins?" General Chen studied the woman more carefully. She hadn't moved closer to the gathering, hadn't tried to blend in or cause any disruption. She simply stood there about 50 yards away, watching with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the morning air. Her hands were clasped in front of her in a way that looked practiced, formal even. "Wait," General Morrison said quietly, holding up a hand to stop the funeral director. "Let's observe her for a moment longer." The other officers began to notice the commotion. Whispers spread through the crowd as more uniformed personnel turned to look at the unusual visitor. Some showed clear disapproval, feeling that a homeless person had no place at such a sacred military ceremony. Others seemed curious about why their commanding officers hadn't immediately ordered her removal. The woman remained motionless, her gaze never leaving the proceedings. As the honor guard began to move the coffin into position, something extraordinary happened. Without any prompting or instruction, the homeless woman slowly brought her right hand to her forehead in what appeared to be a perfect military salute. The gesture was so precise, so automatic, that several officers nearby felt a chill run down their spines. This wasn't someone mimicking what she had seen in movies. The angle of her hand, the straightness of her back despite her obvious physical hardships, the duration of the salute. Everything about it spoke of years of training and muscle memory that never truly fades. General Morrison felt her heart begin to race. She had been in the military for over 30 years, had trained thousands of soldiers, and had seen that exact salute performed countless times. But seeing it executed so flawlessly by someone who looked like she hadn't had a proper meal or shower in months created a cognitive dissonance that left her struggling to understand what she was witnessing. The funeral proceeded, but now many of the attending officers found their attention divided between the ceremony and the mysterious woman at the edge of their gathering. She continued to stand at attention throughout the entire service, never moving, never speaking, never doing anything that would disrupt the solemnity of the occasion. When the 21-gun salute began, the homeless woman didn't flinch at the sharp crack of the rifles like most civilians would. Instead, she seemed to anticipate each shot, her body remaining steady and composed throughout the thunderous tribute. It was another small detail that suggested familiarity with military customs and traditions. As the ceremony concluded and the flag was folded with ceremonial precision, the woman slowly lowered her salute. For a brief moment, her weathered face seemed to crumble with emotion, as if the weight of whatever memories she carried had become too heavy to bear. Then, just as quietly as she had appeared, she began to push her squeaky cart away from the gathering. General Chen made a decision that would change everything. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. "Ma'am, could we have a word with you?" The homeless woman stopped but didn't turn around immediately. Her shoulders tensed as if she was debating whether to run or stay. When she finally turned to face the approaching generals, her eyes held a mixture of fear, dignity, and something else that neither officer could quite identify at first glance. Up close, the generals could see more details that deepened the mystery. Despite her obvious hardships, there were subtle signs that spoke of a different past. The way she met their gaze directly, without the downcast eyes typical of someone accustomed to shame or subservience. Small scars on her hands that looked like they might have come from training exercises rather than street life. "We noticed your salute," General Morrison said gently, trying not to sound accusatory or demanding. It was very precise. "Have you had military training?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that none of them were quite ready to consider. The homeless woman's lips pressed together in a thin line, and for a moment it seemed like she might simply turn and walk away without answering. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that no one wanted to be the first to cross. The homeless woman studied the faces of the two generals, searching for something that even she might not have been able to name. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her shopping cart, knuckles showing white through the dirt and grime that covered her hands. "Sarah," she said finally, her voice hoarse from disuse but carrying an underlying strength that surprised everyone within earshot. "Sarah Martinez." The way she said her name suggested it had been a long time since anyone had asked for it, longer still since she had spoken it with any sense of pride or identity. General Morrison felt a jolt of recognition at the surname, though she couldn't immediately place why it seemed familiar. Mexican-American families had a long and distinguished history of military service, and she had served alongside many Martinez families over the years. But there was something specific nagging at the back of her mind, some memory that refused to surface clearly. "Sarah Martinez," General Chen repeated thoughtfully. "And you served? What branch, what years?" His tone remained respectful, but carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to getting answers to important questions. Sarah's eyes darted between the two officers and the small crowd of military personnel who had begun to gather at a respectful distance. Some were clearly curious about the unusual interaction, while others seemed impatient to conclude the day's proceedings and return to their regular duties. "Army," she said, the single word carrying more weight than many full sentences. "Ranger qualified. 2 tours Afghanistan, 1 Iraq." She spoke these achievements like someone reciting items from a grocery list, but the generals caught the subtle straightening of her posture as she mentioned her Ranger qualification. The crowd around them grew noticeably quieter. Ranger qualification was no small accomplishment, representing some of the most demanding military training available. It meant months of physical and mental challenges that broke many strong candidates. For a woman to have achieved it during the years Sarah would have served made it even more remarkable. As female soldiers faced additional barriers and skepticism, General Morrison felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click together in her mind. "What years did you serve, Sergeant Martinez?" The rank felt natural as she said it, though she realized she was making an assumption based on Sarah's responses and bearing. "Staff Sergeant," Sarah corrected quietly. 2001 to 2015, 14th year of service. She paused, something painful flickering across her weathered features. "Medically discharged." The timeline hit General Chen like a physical blow. 2001 to 2015 covered some of the most intense combat years in recent American military history. The early days of Afghanistan, the Iraq invasion, the surge years when casualties were highest and deployments were longest. Sarah Martinez hadn't just served during wartime. She had served during the most dangerous and demanding period many current officers could remember. 14th year, General Morrison said slowly, understanding dawning in her voice. "You were career military. 1 year short of retirement benefits." Sarah nodded once, a sharp military-style acknowledgement that confirmed what the generals were beginning to suspect. She had been so close to securing her pension and healthcare benefits, so close to the financial security that 20 years of service would have provided. Whatever had led to her medical discharge had cost her not just her career, but her entire future. A younger lieutenant standing nearby couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what led to the medical discharge? Combat injury?" The question seemed to hit Sarah like a physical slap. Her entire body went rigid, and for a moment her breathing became rapid and shallow. The generals recognized the signs immediately. They had seen them in too many veterans over the years. PTSD, anxiety, the invisible wounds that were often harder to treat than physical injuries. Multiple issues, Sarah said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. Shrapnel in the back from an IED outside Kandahar. But mostly? She touched her temple with one grimy finger. Mostly, they said I couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The brutal honesty of her admission created an uncomfortable silence among the gathered officers. Many of them had seen good soldiers broken by the psychological demands of repeated combat deployments. The military had made significant strides in understanding and treating mental health issues, but during Sarah's years of service, there was still significant stigma attached to psychological injuries. General Chen felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. He had fought for years to improve how the military treated veterans struggling with PTSD and other combat-related mental health issues. Too many good soldiers had been pushed out of service when they needed help, not punishment or dismissal. The Martinez case, General Morrison said suddenly, the memory finally surfacing clearly. Operation Enduring Shield. You're that Martinez. Her voice carried a mixture of recognition and something approaching awe. Sarah's head snapped up, surprise replacing the guarded expression she had maintained throughout the conversation. You know about that? Know about it? General Morrison stepped closer, lowering her voice but not her intensity. That operation is taught in advanced tactical courses. Your unit's actions saved an entire Afghan village from being overrun. The intelligence you gathered led to the capture of 3 high-value targets and disrupted a major Taliban supply line. The other officers began to murmur among themselves as word spread through the group. Operation Enduring Shield had been classified for years, but had eventually become legendary within certain military circles. It represented exactly the kind of small unit initiative and tactical brilliance that the Army tried to instill in its leaders. Sarah looked uncomfortable with the attention and recognition. That was the whole team. I just did my job. Your job, General Chen said firmly, included leading that team for the final 36 hours after your lieutenant was wounded. Your job included making decisions under fire that professional strategists still study and admire. For the first time since the conversation began, Sarah's facade cracked slightly. Her eyes became bright with unshed tears and her voice shook when she spoke. None of that mattered when they decided I was too damaged to continue serving. The pain in her words was raw and immediate. Here was a decorated combat veteran, someone who had served with distinction and courage, reduced to living on the streets because the system she had given 14 years of her life to serve had failed her when she needed it most. General Morrison made a decision that would echo through the rest of the day and far beyond. Sarah, would you do us the honor of joining us for coffee? We have some things we'd like to discuss with you. The invitation hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Sarah stared at the 2 generals as if they had just spoken in a foreign language. The concept of being invited anywhere, much less by high-ranking military officers, seemed so far removed from her current reality that she struggled to process the words. Her hands unconsciously smoothed down her torn jacket, a gesture that spoke of muscle memory from a time when appearance and military bearing mattered. I'm not exactly dressed for company, she said quietly, gesturing to her layered clothing and the shopping cart that contained everything she owned. The cart held a strange mixture of practical survival items and carefully preserved military memorabilia. A combat knife still sharp and clean, a faded photograph in a waterproof sleeve, and what appeared to be a folded American flag tucked beneath some blankets. You're dressed like someone who has served our country with honor, General Morrison replied firmly. That's all that matters to us. The small crowd of military personnel had begun to disperse, but several officers lingered nearby, clearly intrigued by the unfolding situation. Word was already spreading through their ranks about the homeless veteran, who had turned out to be a decorated former staff sergeant with an impressive service record. Sarah hesitated for another long moment, her eyes scanning the faces around her as if searching for signs of pity or judgment. When she found neither, something seemed to shift inside her. Okay, she said simply. But I keep my cart with me. The generals exchanged a quick glance. Of course, General Chen nodded. We wouldn't expect anything else. They began walking toward the base commissary, an unusual procession that drew stares from everyone they passed. Two generals in full-dress uniform, flanked by a homeless woman pushing a squeaky shopping cart. It was not a sight commonly seen on military installations. But neither general showed any embarrassment or concern about appearances. If anything, they seemed to walk a little taller, as if proud to be in Sarah's company. The commissary was relatively quiet during the mid-morning hour, with only a few off-duty personnel grabbing coffee or early lunch. When the group entered, conversation stopped and heads turned. The duty manager, a civilian employee named Frank who had worked on the base for over 20 years, started to approach with obvious concern about the homeless woman, but General Morrison's slight shake of the head stopped him in his tracks. They found a corner table where Sarah could park her cart nearby without blocking foot traffic. As they settled into their chairs, the contrast between the officers' crisp uniforms and Sarah's weathered appearance seemed to fade somewhat. There was something about the way Sarah held herself, even in civilian clothes, that spoke of shared experiences and mutual understanding. General Chen returned from the counter with 3 cups of coffee and a selection of pastries. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup as if it were precious. The simple act of someone bringing her food without expectation of payment or service seemed to overwhelm her briefly. "When did you last have a hot meal?" General Morrison asked gently. Sarah thought for a moment. "The shelter serves dinner, but I haven't been there in a few days." "Maybe a week?" She took a small sip of coffee and closed her eyes briefly, savoring the warmth and flavor. "This is good. Real good, Sarah," General Chen said, leaning forward slightly. "Can you tell us what happened after your discharge? How did you end up?" He gestured vaguely, trying to find diplomatic words. "Living on the streets?" Sarah finished for him with a bitter smile. "It's okay, General. I know what I look like." She took another sip of coffee before continuing. "The discharge came with a 60% disability rating. Should have been enough to live on. But the paperwork got tangled up. Appeals process took months, then years. Meanwhile, the bills kept coming." She picked at one of the pastries, eating small bites as if she wasn't quite sure it was really hers to consume. "Had some family, but they didn't understand the nightmares, the anxiety attacks. Thought I should just get over it since the war was done. When the money ran out and I couldn't work regular jobs because of the episodes, things got hard fast." The generals listened in silence, both recognizing a story they had heard far too many times before. The bureaucratic delays, the family members who didn't understand combat trauma, the spiral from middle-class stability to homelessness. It was a path that too many veterans had been forced to walk. "The really tough part," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she talked, "wasn't losing the apartment or the car. It was losing myself. 14 years in the Army. You know exactly who you are, what you're supposed to do, how you fit into something bigger than yourself. Then suddenly you're a civilian and nobody needs you anymore." General Morrison felt her throat tighten with emotion. "But you've maintained your discipline, your military bearing. Even living rough, you haven't lost that core part of yourself." Sarah looked up sharply. "You noticed that?" "The salute gave you away," General Chen smiled. "Perfect form, perfect timing. That doesn't come from watching movies or reading books. That's years of training and pride in service." For the first time since they had started talking, Sarah smiled genuinely. It transformed her weathered face, revealing hints of the confident young soldier she had once been. "Guess old habits die hard. Sometimes I catch myself standing at attention when I hear the national anthem playing somewhere." They talked for another hour, sharing stories and experiences that bridged the gap between their current circumstances. Sarah described some of her combat experiences with a soldier's matter-of-fact tone, while the generals shared their own memories of difficult deployments and challenging decisions. Despite the vast difference in their current situations, they spoke as equals, veterans who understood each other's sacrifices and struggles. As their conversation wound down, General Morrison made an observation that would prove to be pivotal. "Sarah, you mentioned appeals and paperwork problems with your disability benefits. Have you had any legal assistance with that process?" Sarah shook her head. "Couldn't afford a lawyer, and the free legal aid clinics have waiting lists longer than my enlistment contract." The two generals exchanged another meaningful glance. Both had connections within the Veterans Affairs system, contacts who might be able to cut through bureaucratic red tape that had trapped Sarah in poverty for years. Would you be willing to let us look into your case? General Chen asked carefully. We might know some people who could help straighten out those benefit issues. Sarah's eyes grew wide with something that might have been hope, mixed with disbelief. You would do that? For someone like me? For someone exactly like you, General Morrison said firmly. A decorated veteran who served with distinction and deserves the support that was promised to her. The next morning brought a flurry of phone calls and official inquiries that Sarah could never have imagined. General Morrison had spent the previous evening making calls to contacts throughout the military bureaucracy, while General Chen had reached out to veterans advocacy organizations and legal aid societies. Both officers had approached Sarah's case with the same methodical precision they brought to military operations. Sarah herself was staying temporarily in a small motel room that General Morrison had quietly arranged and paid for. It was nothing fancy, just a clean bed, a hot shower, and cable television. But to someone who had been sleeping in shelters and doorways, it felt like luxury beyond measure. She had spent nearly an hour just standing under the hot water, washing away months of accumulated grime and fatigue. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Colonel Janet Williams, a military attorney specializing in veterans' benefits appeals, had reviewed Sarah's case files and discovered what she called a systematic pattern of administrative negligence. The paperwork errors weren't random mistakes, they appeared to be part of a broader problem affecting hundreds of veterans who had been medically discharged during the same time period. This is bigger than just your case. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Colonel Williams explained during a conference call with the generals. We're looking at what appears to be deliberate delays and lost paperwork affecting veterans with combat-related PTSD. Someone was either grossly incompetent or intentionally making it difficult for these veterans to receive their benefits. General Chen felt his anger rising as he listened to the details. Are you telling me that Sarah and others like her have been living in poverty for years because of bureaucratic malfeasance? That's exactly what I'm telling you, sir, and I think we have grounds for both individual appeals and a class action investigation. Sarah listened to the conference call from her motel room, struggling to process the idea that her years of hardship might have been preventable, the possibility that her suffering had been caused not by honest mistakes but by systematic negligence was both infuriating and somehow validating. It meant that her inability to navigate the system hadn't been a personal failure. While the legal wheels began turning, the generals initiated a more immediate plan to address Sarah's current situation. General Morrison had connections with several veteran-owned businesses in the area, companies that made it a point to hire military veterans whenever possible. Sarah's skills and experience, they reasoned, should make her an attractive candidate once her immediate needs were addressed. The first interview was scheduled for that afternoon at a security consulting firm run by a retired Army colonel named Marcus Thompson. The company specialized in training security personnel for high-risk assignments, and Sarah's Ranger background and combat experience were exactly what they needed for their instructor positions. General Morrison accompanied Sarah to the interview, partly for moral support and partly to provide context about Sarah's current circumstances. Sarah had managed to clean up considerably with access to shower facilities and some donated clothes, but she was still clearly nervous about returning to professional interactions after years of surviving on the margins. Colonel Thompson, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with graying temples and kind eyes, immediately put Sarah at ease. Staff Sergeant Martinez, he said, standing to shake her hand as if she were still in uniform. It's an honor to meet you. I've heard remarkable things about your service record. The interview quickly became more of a conversation between fellow veterans than a formal job screening. Colonel Thompson was particularly interested in Sarah's experience training Afghan National Army units, a skill set that translated directly to civilian security training. By the end of their discussion, he had offered her a position as a tactics instructor, with a starting salary that would allow her to rent an apartment and begin rebuilding her life. There's one condition, Colonel Thompson said as they concluded the interview. We require all our instructors to undergo regular counseling and mental health support. Combat veterans often carry invisible injuries, and we've found that ongoing professional support helps everyone perform at their best. Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected understanding and support. You mean having PTSD won't disqualify me from the job? On the contrary, Colonel Thompson smiled. It qualifies you to understand and help other veterans who might be struggling with similar challenges. We're not looking for perfect people, Staff Sergeant. We're looking for real people who've been through real challenges and come out stronger. The transformation in Sarah over the following weeks was remarkable to witness. With stable housing and meaningful work, she began to rediscover the confident, capable person she had been during her military service. The nightmares and anxiety attacks didn't disappear overnight, but regular counseling sessions and the structure of employment helped her develop better coping strategies. General Morrison and General Chen made it a point to stay in contact with Sarah throughout her transition. They would occasionally stop by the security training facility to observe her classes, always impressed by her natural teaching ability and the respect she commanded from her students. During one such visit, they watched Sarah leading a group of young security trainees through an urban warfare simulation. Her instructions were clear and precise, her tactical knowledge evident in every scenario she created. But what impressed the generals most was how she incorporated lessons about mental resilience and stress management into the technical training. Remember, Sarah told her students during a break in the exercise, the most important weapon you carry isn't your sidearm or your radio. It's your ability to stay calm and think clearly under pressure. And if that weapon gets damaged by what you experience in the field, there's no shame in getting it repaired by talking to a counselor or therapist. After the training session, General Morrison approached Sarah with obvious pride. You're not just teaching tactics, are you? You're teaching them how to take care of themselves and each other. Sarah nodded, wiping sweat from her forehead with a clean towel. I learned the hard way that surviving the mission isn't enough if you can't survive coming home afterward. These young people deserve to know that from the beginning. The legal case was progressing as well. Colonel Williams had discovered that Sarah's situation was part of a pattern affecting over 300 veterans from the same time period. The class action investigation had attracted the attention of congressional committees and veterans advocacy groups. While the wheels of justice turned slowly, there was growing confidence that significant reforms would result from their efforts. More immediately, Sarah's individual benefits appeal had been fast-tracked and approved. The back payment of benefits she should have received over the years amounted to a substantial sum, enough to establish real financial security for the first time since her discharge. As Sarah signed the paperwork to purchase her first home in nearly a decade, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few months. But the moment that meant the most to her had nothing to do with money or housing or employment. It came when General Morrison handed her an official letter she had requested. The letter Sarah held in her trembling hands was simple in its language but profound in its implications. It was an official recommendation from two serving generals requesting that Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez be considered for reinstatement to active duty, with full recognition of her previous service record and accommodation for her documented medical conditions. You want to go back? General Chen had asked when Sarah first mentioned the possibility. After everything that happened, everything you've been through? Sarah had looked out the window of her new apartment, watching young soldiers from the nearby base jogging in formation down the street. It's not about wanting to go back to what was, she had said quietly. It's about wanting to be part of something bigger than myself again. And maybe helping to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to others. The reinstatement process was complex and unusual, but Sarah's case had attracted enough high-level attention that exceptions were being considered. The Army had learned valuable lessons about retaining experienced personnel and supporting veterans with combat-related mental health challenges. Sarah represented both a second chance for an individual soldier and an opportunity for the institution to demonstrate its evolving approach to veteran care. During the evaluation process, Sarah underwent extensive medical and psychological assessments. The doctors were impressed by how much her condition had improved with proper treatment and stable living conditions. While they confirmed that she would always need ongoing support for her PTSD, they concluded that with appropriate accommodations, she could certainly return to meaningful military service. The psychological evaluator, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, no relation despite sharing the same surname, spent several sessions with Sarah exploring her motivations and mental state. Most people in your situation would want nothing to do with the institution that failed them, Dr. Martinez observed. What makes you different? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. The institution didn't fail me. Some people within it made mistakes, but the Army itself, the mission, the values, the sense of purpose that saved my life more than once. I want to be part of fixing the problems, not walking away from them. While awaiting the final decision on reinstatement, Sarah continued her work as a tactics instructor and became increasingly involved in veterans advocacy. She began speaking at conferences and workshops about veteran homelessness, sharing her story with audiences of military personnel, social workers, and government officials. Her presentations were powerful not because they were polished or professionally crafted, but because they were authentic and practical. Sarah spoke about the specific moments when she had felt most abandoned by the system, but also about the individuals who had made crucial differences in her recovery. She emphasized that preventing veteran homelessness was not just about providing services, but about maintaining connection and dignity throughout the transition process. General Morrison attended one of Sarah's presentations to a group of senior military officers and Department of Veterans Affairs officials. She watched with pride as Sarah confidently addressed the room full of high-ranking officials, offering concrete recommendations based on her lived experience. "The problem isn't that we don't have programs to help veterans," Sarah told the audience. "The problem is that we have too many programs that don't talk to each other, and we make veterans jump through so many hoops to access help that many of them give up before they get what they need." She went on to describe her own experience navigating the bureaucracy, how each office she visited seemed to require different paperwork and have different rules. "By the time I'd been to 5 different offices and filled out dozens of forms, I felt like I was being punished for asking for help instead of being supported for having served." The presentation concluded with Sarah's most important recommendation: peer support programs that connected veterans struggling with transition issues to veterans who had successfully navigated similar challenges. "When General Morrison and General Chen first talked to me in that cemetery, what mattered wasn't their rank or their authority. What mattered was that they recognized me as a fellow soldier who deserved respect and support." After the presentation, several audience members approached Sarah with questions and comments. One Department of Veterans Affairs administrator asked if she would be willing to consult on redesigning their intake and appeals processes. A congressional aide inquired about her availability to testify at upcoming hearings on veteran services reform. But the conversation that meant the most to Sarah came from a young Army captain who approached her hesitantly after most of the crowd had dispersed. "Ma'am," the captain said, "I'm struggling with some issues from my deployment, and I'm scared that asking for help will hurt my career. After hearing your story, I wanted to ask, do you think seeking counseling is worth the risk?" Sarah looked at the young officer, seeing herself from years earlier, dedicated, afraid, and carrying burdens that seemed too heavy to share. "Captain," she said gently, "the biggest risk you can take is not getting help when you need it. I learned that the hard way, but you don't have to." She spent another 20 minutes talking with the captain, providing contact information for confidential counseling services and assuring him that seeking mental health support was a sign of strength, not weakness. As the young officer left looking relieved and determined, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with her own recovery and everything to do with preventing another veteran from following her path to homelessness. Theo. Call about her reinstatement came on a Tuesday morning while Sarah was preparing for another day of training classes. General Morrison's voice carried barely contained excitement as she delivered the news. "Sarah, I'm calling with official word on your reinstatement application. The review board has approved your return to active duty, effective immediately if you choose to accept. You'll be assigned to the Army's new Veteran Transition Support Division with the rank of Sergeant First Class, a promotion that recognizes both your previous service and your recent contributions to veteran advocacy." Sarah sat down heavily, overwhelmed by emotions she hadn't expected. After years of feeling rejected and abandoned by the military, she was being invited not just to return, but to return with honor and increased responsibility. "There's more," General Morrison continued. "Your primary assignment will be developing and implementing peer support programs for veterans struggling with transition issues. Essentially, the Army wants you to do officially what you've been doing voluntarily, helping other veterans navigate the system and find the support they need." It was, Sarah realized, more than just a job offer. It was recognition that her struggles hadn't been meaningless, that her experiences could be transformed into tools to help others. The homeless veteran who had stood silently at the edge of a military funeral was being asked to help ensure that other veterans never had to stand in that same place. The swearing-in ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 18 months after Sarah had first been spotted at the military funeral. General Morrison administered the oath of enlistment while General Chen stood as witness, both officers taking obvious pride in the moment they had helped create. Sarah wore a brand new Army combat uniform with fresh Sergeant First Class stripes, her boots polished to a mirror shine, and her bearing every inch the professional soldier she had always been beneath the layers of hardship. But the most significant change wasn't in her appearance. It was in her eyes, which now held confidence and purpose instead of the guarded wariness that had defined her during those months on the streets. Colonel Thompson and several of Sarah's former students from the security training company attended the ceremony, along with Dr. Martinez, Colonel Williams, and a handful of other individuals who had played crucial roles in Sarah's recovery. It was a small gathering, but each person present understood the significance of what they were witnessing. "Do you solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic?" General Morrison asked, her voice carrying the weight of tradition and personal emotion. "I do," Sarah replied, her voice strong and clear, echoing across the small ceremony space with absolute conviction. As the formal ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and congratulations. But the moment that touched her most deeply came when a young private approached her hesitantly, clearly nervous about speaking to a senior non-commissioned officer. "Sergeant First Class Martinez," the private said, snapping to attention. "I heard about your story, ma'am. I wanted to thank you for coming back. My brother is struggling with some issues after his deployment, and knowing that someone like you made it through gives me hope for him." Sarah returned the private's salute with precision, then stepped closer to speak quietly. "Private, you tell your brother that asking for help isn't giving up, it's fighting back. And remind him that his fellow soldiers are here to support him, no matter what he's going through." The young soldier's relief was visible as he thanked her and moved away. Sarah realized that this was exactly why she had chosen to return to military service. Not for herself, but for all the brothers and sisters in arms who might be struggling with invisible wounds and needed to know they weren't alone. Sarah's new office was located in a recently constructed building dedicated to veteran services and transition support. Her title was Director of Peer Support Programs, and her mission was to create systematic ways for veterans to help other veterans navigate the challenges of military to civilian transition. Her first major initiative involved establishing mentor relationships between recently discharged veterans and those who had successfully completed their own transitions. The program paired individuals based on shared experiences, combat veterans with combat veterans, those who had struggled with mental health issues with others who had found successful coping strategies. The pilot program launched with 30 mentor veteran pairs, carefully selected and extensively trained. Sarah personally oversaw the matching process, using her intuition and experience to identify combinations that would be most effective. She insisted that all mentors, regardless of their current success, acknowledge their own ongoing challenges rather than pretending to have achieved perfect recovery. Within 6 months, the program had expanded to include over 200 veteran pairs across multiple military installations. The results were remarkable. Veterans in the program showed significantly lower rates of homelessness, unemployment, and mental health crises compared to those receiving traditional transition services alone. Sarah's approach emphasized practical support over bureaucratic processes. Instead of focusing on paperwork and regulations, her programs connected veterans with immediate needs to veterans who could provide immediate help. Need job search assistance? Talk to a veteran who had successfully changed careers. Struggling with VA benefits applications? Connect with someone who had navigated the system successfully. The success of Sarah's programs attracted national attention. She was invited to present her findings at the Pentagon, to congressional committees, and to veteran service organizations across the country. Media outlets began featuring stories about the homeless veteran who became a military leader, though Sarah always redirected attention from her personal story to the broader issues and solutions. During one particularly significant presentation to defense department leadership. Sarah was asked about the key factors that made her program successful when so many other initiatives had failed. The difference, Sarah explained, is that we treat veterans as resources, not just as people needing help. Every veteran who comes to us for support also has something valuable to offer someone else. We create communities of mutual support instead of one-way charity relationships. She went on to describe how veterans in her programs often found that helping others was as healing for them as receiving help had been. Combat veterans discovered that sharing their experiences with newer veterans helped process their own trauma. Those who had overcome substance abuse issues found purpose in guiding others through recovery. General Chen, who attended the Pentagon presentation, watched with obvious pride as Sarah fielded questions from some of the most senior military leaders in the country. After the formal session, he approached her with a broad smile. "Sergeant First Class Martinez," he said, "I have to ask, do you ever regret the path that led you here? If things had gone differently, if your benefits had been processed correctly from the beginning, you might have avoided years of hardship." Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "General, I wouldn't wish homelessness and desperation on anyone, but I can't regret experiences that led me to understand problems I never would have seen from inside the system. I can help veterans now in ways I never could have if I hadn't walked in their shoes." She paused, looking out the window at a group of young soldiers conducting training exercises on the Pentagon grounds. "Besides, some of the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fires. Maybe I needed to be broken down completely before I could be rebuilt into something more useful." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. "If you'll excuse me, General, I need to respond to this. It's from one of our program graduates who just got promoted to team leader at his civilian job. He wanted to share the good news with someone who would understand what it means." As Sarah typed her congratulatory response, General Chen reflected on the remarkable transformation he had witnessed. The broken, homeless veteran they had encountered at that funeral had become one of the most effective advocates for veteran welfare he had ever seen. More importantly, she had become a symbol of resilience and hope for thousands of veterans who needed to believe that recovery and redemption were possible. The ripple effects of Sarah's work continued to expand beyond her direct programs. Military leadership began implementing policy changes based on her recommendations. Training programs for military personnel included new modules on recognizing and responding to mental health challenges. The stigma surrounding psychological injuries continued to diminish as more success stories emerged from Sarah's peer support networks. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural, the growing recognition that veterans were not just recipients of services, but valuable resources for solving the very problems they had experienced. Sarah's model of peer support was being adapted and implemented across multiple government agencies and nonprofit organizations. 3 years after her reinstatement, Sarah stood once again in a military cemetery. But this time the circumstances were entirely different. She wore the uniform of a master sergeant, having been promoted twice in recognition of her outstanding contributions to veteran welfare programs. More importantly, she was no longer an observer at the margins. She was officiating at the funeral of a veteran who had died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family and friends, after receiving the support and care he needed in his final years. The veteran being honored, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, no relation to General Chen, had been one of the first participants in Sarah's peer support program. When he had first come to her office 4 years earlier, he had been homeless, struggling with addiction, and convinced that his life had no value or purpose. Through patient mentorship and the support of other veterans who understood his struggles, Robert had rebuilt his life, reconciled with his family, and spent his final years helping other veterans navigate their own recovery journeys. As Sarah delivered the eulogy, she reflected on how much had changed since that day when she had stood silently at the edge of a funeral ceremony. Unknown and unrecognized, the military cemetery was the same, the traditions were the same, but everything else about her relationship to this community had transformed completely. Staff Sergeant Chen once told me, Sarah said to the assembled mourners, that the most important battle he ever fought wasn't in Afghanistan or Iraq. It was the battle to believe that his life still had meaning after he came home. Today we honor not just his military service, but his courage in fighting that battle and his dedication to helping others fight theirs. Among the crowd were dozens of veterans whose lives had been touched by Robert's mentorship and advocacy. Many had driven hundreds of miles to attend the funeral, a testament to the bonds formed through shared struggle and mutual support. Sarah recognized faces from her programs, veterans who had overcome homelessness, addiction, unemployment, and despair to rebuild meaningful lives. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, General Morrison approached Sarah with obvious emotion. The general had continued to follow Sarah's career and programs with personal interest, attending graduations, celebrations, and now this solemn farewell. Master Sergeant Martinez, General Morrison said, "I've been thinking about that day we first met you. Did you have any idea then that things would turn out like this?" Sarah smiled, remembering the desperation and hopelessness she had felt during those dark months. "General, on that day I wasn't sure I'd live to see another month, much less build a career helping other veterans. I was just trying to honor a fallen soldier the only way I knew how. And in doing so, you reminded us who you were," General Morrison replied. "Sometimes I think we found you at that funeral, but other times I think you found us. Either way, the timing was perfect." They were joined by General Chen, now a few years older but still carrying himself with the same quiet authority Sarah remembered from their first meeting. He had become one of the strongest advocates for Sarah's programs within the Pentagon, using his influence to secure funding and policy support for peer-based veteran services. "Master Sergeant," General Chen said, "I have some news I think you'll find interesting. The Defense Department has decided to implement your peer support model across all branches of the military. Every major installation will have programs based on your designs, and you've been selected to oversee the nationwide implementation." The promotion that came with this new responsibility would make Sarah one of the most senior enlisted personnel in the Army, with influence and authority that extended far beyond what she could have imagined during her original military career. But more than the rank or prestige, what excited her was the opportunity to help thousands more veterans who might otherwise fall through the cracks of an imperfect system. "There's one more thing," General Morrison added with a mysterious smile. "The Army has approved a special recognition for your contributions to veteran welfare. You'll be receiving the Distinguished Service Medal in a ceremony next month." Sarah felt her knees go weak with surprise and emotion. The Distinguished Service Medal was one of the military's highest honors, typically reserved for senior officers who had made exceptional contributions to national defense. For an enlisted soldier to receive such recognition was almost unprecedented. "Generals," Sarah said, struggling to find adequate words, "I don't know what to say. When I was living on the streets, I thought my military career was over, that everything I had worked for was lost. Now you're telling me that the worst period of my life has led to the greatest honor I could imagine. That's not coincidence," General Chen replied. "That's what real leadership looks like, turning personal adversity into service to others. You've done more to strengthen our military's care for veterans than most generals accomplish in entire careers." As the three of them walked through the cemetery, passing row after row of markers honoring fallen soldiers, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The path from homeless veteran to national leader had been neither straight nor predictable, but each challenge had prepared her for the responsibilities she now carried. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a veteran in California who had just secured stable housing after months in her peer support program. Another message followed from a mentor in Texas celebrating his mentee's successful completion of college. Then came a photo from a group of veterans in Florida who had started their own nonprofit organization to help homeless veterans in their community. These messages arrived daily now. Updates, questions, celebrations, and occasionally requests for help with crises. Sarah had become a central figure in an informal network of thousands of veterans who supported each other across geographical and institutional boundaries. The impact of her work had multiplied far beyond what any formal program could have achieved alone. As they reached the cemetery's exit, General Morrison made one final observation. "Sarah, do you remember what you said when we first asked if you'd accept help with your benefits appeal?" "You said you weren't sure you deserved it," Sarah nodded, remembering the shame and self-doubt that had consumed her during those difficult months. "I hope you understand now," General Morrison continued, "that it was never about deserving help. It was about recognizing the value that was always there, even when circumstances had buried it beneath layers of hardship and bureaucratic neglect. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by military leadership, veteran advocates, and representatives from all the programs that had grown from her initial peer support initiative. As the Secretary of Defense pinned the Distinguished Service Medal to her uniform, she thought about Staff Sergeant Robert Chen and all the other veterans who had trusted her with their stories and their struggles. The citation read in part, "For exceptionally meritorious service in developing and implementing innovative veteran support programs that have fundamentally transformed military approaches to veteran welfare and transition assistance. Master Sergeant Martinez's leadership and vision have directly improved the lives of thousands of veterans and their families, while establishing sustainable systems that will continue to serve future generations of military personnel." But for Sarah, the real measure of success wasn't found in medals or ceremonies. It was in the text messages from veterans celebrating new jobs, the photos of veterans reuniting with their families, and the knowledge that somewhere, a veteran who might otherwise give up hope was finding the support and connection needed to rebuild their life. That evening, as Sarah returned to her apartment near the base, she found a package waiting for her. Inside was a hand-carved wooden flag case containing an American flag, along with a note from a group of veterans she had mentored. "This flag flew over the Capitol in honor of your Distinguished Service Medal ceremony. Thank you for reminding us that no veteran fights alone." As Sarah placed the flag case in a place of honor in her living room, she smiled at the irony of her journey. She had begun as a soldier serving her country, lost her way in the system designed to support her, and ultimately found her greatest purpose in ensuring that other veterans would never have to walk that difficult path alone. The homeless stranger who had once stood silently at the margins of a military funeral had become the voice of thousands of veterans, proving that sometimes the most broken among us carry the seeds of the most powerful solutions.